So let's have some quick fire thoughts, I think, could kick us off on delivery and evaluation. The first question I'm going to ask every panel member is, what is your top tip for turning brilliant digital learning into a reality? And we'll start with Nathan on this.
I said it earlier, just try things out. If it works, it worked. If it doesn't, iterate.
Amazing. Eleanor, same question to you. What's your top tip for turning brilliant digital learning ideas into a reality?
Same, basically. But yeah, testing, paper-based testing where you can before you build anything in digital. As I think I mentioned before, digital mistakes are really expensive. Try and avoid that. Starting small. Do it small and well, and then try and grow it from there, rather than I have a tendency to try and be over ambitious. So this is something that I definitely say to myself. And yeah, opportunity to test that, tweak it, and grow from there. Amazing.
Phill, same question. What's your top tip?
I think building what others have already said. Also get somebody else to look at it. You know, very often we go very, I suppose, a little bit ignorant or blind to our own mistakes. Especially if you've spent the time developing something, you often won't spot the obvious. So it's always worth having that colleague or somebody else who's external that you can go to and say, please have a look, give it a play, does it work?
Amazing. And last but not least, Corinna, same question. What's your top tip?
I think everyone else has pretty much covered it. Yep, I'm huge with trial and error. Gut instinct, I think there's something with that. We should know what we're doing by now. So trial it out, dry runs with colleagues, if you can trial it out on your target audience, fantastic. Yeah, fresh eyes, definitely. I totally agree with you, Phill. When you've been working on a project, you're so invested in it that you've got the blinkers on. So yeah, get fresh eyes to look at it before you run it out.
Amazing. I chucked the question out to conference as well. Let us know in the chat. What's your top tip for turning brilliant? Why have I written this question? For turning brilliant digital learning ideas into a reality. It'd be great to have some of those thoughts as we carry on into the next part. So this panel really is moving into the practical side of things, the bit that we think of predominantly when we think about digital learning. And I think delivery in all essences of the word. So whether that's delivering a program, delivering a project, or at the sort of tinier level of physically, like what I'm doing now, I am delivering to you across a screen. And evaluation, we've obviously talked, Eleanor particularly mentioned the importance of that front end research and that evaluation process, and Nathan's point, which I will always agree with, of being iterative, but it's that wrap up if we think about the life cycle of a digital learning project. So my first question to panel on this is, how do you choose when and when not to use technology in on-site learning experiences? And I'm going to come to Phill first on this one.
Okay, so I suppose the first question you need to ask is value added. Okay, so what are the barriers? Will this help us to lessen any barriers that there are there at the moment? Really, why are we using it? What's the purpose behind it? The whole point of technology, and I think that's come across from everybody today, is technology is there to enhance learning. So we need to bear that initial outcome or experience in mind. You know, what are you offering that makes it really stand out, and how does it complement that learning? You know, that's the point. Is it's not to override, it's not to come first, it's to complement. You know, for example, when using digital technology in our virtual aquarium, it's to support the understanding of what is a dinosaur and what isn't a dinosaur. You know, so it's about keeping that aim in mind. It's serving a very clear purpose, and it's been implemented to support that purpose. You know, it isn't about getting a technology in or buying something in and then thinking about how you're going to use it. That's really not a sustainable way to go about things. You know, if you sandwich something in like that without careful consideration, it might make it very shiny, but then again, you know, is it distracting from that original aim of the learning? Is it sustainable in the long run? I think, you know, like I said, it's about complementing, it's about broadening that experience. You know, we use it in our setting to make learning a bit more multisensory, for example, through gamification. So it promotes dialogue, it consolidates understanding amongst peer groups when using tools such as clickers. you know, it's a really good way to get them talking to each other, to build up that friendly discourse, and that element of friendly competition, once again enhancing the learning. You know, QR codes, really good. We've spoken a little about the QR codes in breakout rooms today. It's about signposting further information or loading content onto personal devices or portable devices that are used around site. You know, so it provides another layer of accessibility. If somebody wants to find out more, they want to hear it in a different language, there's a way to do that, and it's fairly low cost. It's fairly, you know, easy to implement. We have a VR, we have an immersive space, and we make use of those only when it will enhance learners' understanding. If we can deepen that connection to nature by using those, if we can promote the value and the love of nature through using those spaces, then we will do it. Another thing to consider if you're thinking about using digital learning on site is capacity. Think about your team. You know, think about the capacity of your audience as well. Is it intuitive to use? You know, when you're introducing a technology to enhance unit learning, it might not be so suitable if it takes 20 minutes of an hour-long learning session to teach an audience how to use it. You know, there's no point in that. So think about that accessibility. Think about how intuitive it is, and is it sustainable as well? I think you know, in a time where technology can often be seen as disposable, but finances are unfortunately getting tighter for a lot of organizations. You know, there's a risk of technology. There's always that risk of technology becoming obsolete or becoming unsupported over time through software. But if we're using technologies that are familiar to people and that they are accessible, then it often means that actually there's going to be greater buy-in by those companies. More people are going to want to use those technologies, and therefore you can get you'll see greater return on that initial investment. I hope that's okay.
That's spot on. I mean, that enhanced idea, I don't think you can say enough, Phill. I think that's where we all are as digital learning experts. Is it's never digital for digital's sake, and I think it's something that we can't say enough, particularly with internal stakeholders, and that sense of, I think all panel members have mentioned it today, that something shiny and new, it doesn't necessarily mean we dive in and do that straight away. And I think Miranda's her top tip, which I'll just read out to everyone if they've not seen in the chat, is about the fact that things need to be updated and adapted because digital moves really quickly. And actually that draws on the QR code point. Do you remember we all laughed at QR codes a couple of years ago? No one's ever going to use QR codes. That P word came in and suddenly everyone's using QR codes. DLNET chat have definitely had a few fun times talking about that. If you've joined us on Twitter for any of those, to really understand where QR codes work and where they don't work, because they're not the catch-all for everybody, and we do have to think about accessibility with those. So back to this question of how do you choose when and when not to use technology in online learning spaces? Corinna, let me come to you on that point.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one for us at the moment. We're having a lot of conversations around this in Parliament. So, I mean, obviously we've got our digital programs, but they're not on site. We do use some tech. Is it really enhancing? We do have, our program is very formal. Students come in, they go on a tour, they come back, they have a workshop. We're very concerned about death by PowerPoint at the moment. It's very formal, very didactic. We want to maybe branch out a bit more, be more experimental, play, gamification. So we are talking about, do we need all the tech elements that we've got? Some of them are fantastic. So we've also got a virtual room. We have a fabulous 360 film giving the whole of the history of Parliament in 12 minutes flat. Students love it. It's great. And it's really bite-sized, like Nathan was talking about, bite-sized, accessible information. We can bring up the House of Commons and the House of Lords virtually, show who sits where, have sound clips of the Speaker and the Prime Minister talking. So it really enhances the tour, the learning process. But then we've had some absolute disasters. So when we got our brand new shiny education centre kind of several years ago, AI was big. So let's put it in the rooms. You held it up to the wall, an iPad up to the wall in the House of Commons. Winston Churchill appeared before you and gave a really long speech. Do the same in the House of Lords. Angels appear off the monarch's throne and start flying around the room. So really creative ideas, But the reality is they've never been used. How do we work that into a very formal session teaching you how legislation's made? It's not relevant. So we're having a lot of conversations around our workshops at the moment. How much tech do we need? But also actually about the tour. The students spend a long time on tour. They're on tour for over an hour. Are there opportunities to use tech on tour? When the House of Commons and the Lords are sitting, you don't get the full tour route. Can we compensate by using tech? So there's an app called Seppo, which you can use to map out rooms. It's often used for treasure hunts as well. So you can kind of have key tourist locations, get the images of it and create a treasure trail. But we potentially are talking about using it on the tour route. So we can have the images of the rooms, and then you can have kind of pinpoints on the rooms, click onto one of those, ask questions in various formats, multiple choice, written answer, set tasks, get students to role play interviewing an MP, and they can record that and add to that. You can create a competitive element with this by giving points, so you can split them into teams as well. So we're having a lot of conversations currently at the moment. Come back to us in a year or two and we might tell you if we've got the balance right. At the moment, we don't think we have, but we've got lots of ideas about how we're going to take this forward and what we can do to make sure we've got that balance.
Amazing. And thank you for being so transparent with us. It is so easy to just say everything works and we're great. No, do you know what? Sometimes things go wrong, and that's great too. That's when we really learn what's happening. And I think it's a really interesting point as well around actually, when does technology have a place here? It's something I talk quite a lot to, is as a human being in the 21st century, do I consciously think I've just picked up my phone? No, I just do it. I just take a photo. I think sometimes when we plan, we really think about, now there's a bit of digital and now we're going to non-digital. Actually, you can allow a little bit more fluidity to that and find those moments as you go through. Eleanor, what are your thoughts on this particular question of this when and when not to use in on-site experience?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said so far, lots of wisdom in there. And definitely, I think I spend as much time trying to persuade people not to use digital as I do the opposite. I think that as we're in learning, and so it's all about, excuse me, starting with the learning objectives and being really grounded in that. The design of all learning experiences should start there. The technology is a tool. And the learning is the core component. What is it that we want our learners to be left with at the end? Banging on again about audience research and thinking about like what is it that they need and want from us, and then really crucially identifying the barriers to learning. So to echo what Phill was saying about, what is it that technology can do to help it improve the learning experience and remove those barriers? How can they be removed? And going back to kind of like your, testing, I really do think it's really great to test other people's tools, not just your own, and test them with your audiences. What do they like about them? It's all very well to read the reports about how brilliant these things are, but actually there's nothing like on the ground testing. What are the barriers? What are the frustrations? Even the best things can be improved. So what are those things? It's really valuable to get those nuggets. And then also to assess them alongside whatever non-digital options might be available. So you're assessing the whole and not just one thing, about thinking about this problem that you're trying to solve, looking at all the different tools, including all the digital options available to you, and you're making an informed decision that includes the value, the benefits, the challenges, which other speakers just outlined, particularly that future proofing. It's something that often gets missed about what are you going to do when, in our case, the project funding that we've got at the moment isn't forever. What do we do to make sure that this is going to continue into the future? Really important part of the thinking. And then I would also just say, in terms of, because I think it came up in one of the rooms that we were talking about, in terms of internal stakeholders who do love a whizzy tech. Often it's like, we've seen this lovely thing, we think you should use it. Data is really your friend when you want to talk to people about these kinds of things. It's really hard to argue with data when you know what your audiences, need and want from you, when you know what works and where the challenges are with certain data, to be able to really have an informed conversation with any internal stakeholders or others who might be kind of, excited by technology, which is great, but you're grounding it in the data so that you're making that informed decision.
Completely agree. Data is our best friend. That is sometimes where we just have to go. And I think it's a really interesting point. We talk about this when or when not, that actually all of you are pulling that idea of, well, actually, it's not a one-off decision. That is something that you will continually come back to, and saying no isn't no forever. It's just no for right now with the knowledge and the insight that you have. I feel like I'm going to misquote, because it is one of the Obamas, and I can't remember if it's Barack Obama or Michelle Obama, who made the point that if you're 51% convinced, you might as well be 100% convinced, because you've crossed that line into you are more convinced than less convinced. And sometimes that's all we can do, is just be on the edge of, we are more convinced this is a good idea right now with the information we have than it might, but it might change in the future. Okay, so a reminder to everyone at conference that we are here for the rest of the hour. So if people have got questions, please do chuck them in and I will make sure to incorporate them. Don't feel like you have to wait till the end. I can multitask. But we'll move on to our next question, or the next question that I particularly got, which is, what methods do you find the most effective when sharing your offer to audiences? And that's an actively broad question, panel, so feel free to interpret that as you will. Corinna, let's go to you first on that.
Great, thanks, John. So I'm going to take quite a practical approach. Facilitator, that's my role. Let's go down the facilitation route. What kind of best practice is there out there for help actually delivering these sessions? The first thing I'd say, again, I'm going to go with the send focus on this, is do your prep. So again, thinking about who your audience are, speak to your teachers in advance where possible, speak to your audience in advance to help you work out pitching. So within SEND, there are 3 levels of learning. We all talk about key stages when we're talking about formal learning, formal schools, but SEND is totally different. We have students are pre-curriculum, so they're working totally outside of the curriculum. Semi-formal curriculum, some work within the curriculum, some work outside of, and then we get to national curriculum levels. So bear those levels in mind when you're teaching, when you're conveying your messages, your work to the students. We do a lot of work with the teachers in advance of SEND. We send out a teacher pack, which has glossaries of key terms. I was talking about language earlier, so breaking down those language, what is our jargon? But we also have one for the students. We send out an easy read glossary, breaking down and explaining complicated terms. We send out key Makaton signs and symbols that may be used in the session. What else do we send out? We send out a list of items that teachers can use in the classroom. So if I'm talking about how when we have the Queen, her favourite smells lavender, let's let the students smell lavender if they've got something in the classroom. So again, breaking through those walls. We meet with teachers in advance of the sessions so that we can find out how best to pitch the session to the students' needs. We also meet with students sometimes. So particularly for a SEND audience, there can be a lot of anxiety about who are these strange people who are going to come in and talk to us. So we have a 5-minute meet and greet. We'll just set it up on Teams. Hi, I'm Corinna. Ask me anything you want. What's my favourite animal? What's my favourite colour? What am I going to be talking to you about next week? So it just kind of eases those anxieties. So when you're going in to actually teach the session, you don't need to spend time doing an icebreaker because we've done it. We've already kind of broken down those barriers. I'm not kind of just a strange person looming at them through the screen. Or if teachers don't want that, we send them a delightful photo of our ugly mugs, the people who are going to be presenting it. So again, we're not a strange face. What else when sharing? Manage the expectations. So what are we going to do today? How are we going to do it? Why are we going to do it? Not only so teachers know what the session's going to cover, they know they're getting what they signed up for, but students are aware of how that session's going to work. Again, this can work well for reducing anxiety, for not just for SEND, for mainstream students. We've all had kind of year 9s coming in, please don't put me on the spot, please, I don't want to talk to you, or I'll talk to you, I'll offer it up. Explaining what we're going to do, let's relieve that anxiety. I am not going to make you sing and dance for me. If you want to, fabulous. We can go with that, but this is actually what we're going to be doing. Use props. Break down that fourth wall. I know that's really pretentious. I was a drama student. Break down that fourth wall. So with the sensory session, we're hoping to send out a loan box, but currently we send teachers a list of items, things that they can use in the class. So the seats of the House of Commons, we all know the famous green leather. If you've got green leather, fabulous. If not, have some green material and we can reinforce green for the House of Commons. And as I was saying earlier, we have perspex discs. We'll turn the whole screen green for them. Anytime we mention the Commons, let's go green. We talk about the throne and we talk about the crown the monarch uses. Let's role play being the monarch. We'll wear crowns. We have a kilo weight, the weight of the crown. So let's all put it on our heads and find out how heavy that crown is. The king does a speech wearing that. Can you talk while you've got that weight on your head? So use props, use items. They're not only great for SEND students, but I mean, all students like to do a bit of role play. Who doesn't like to pretend this the speaker and yell order at the top of their voices in classroom? When do they get to yell in class? This is going to sound ironic coming from myself. Don't talk too much. Allow students, we talk for a living. It's hard not to talk, but information overload is real. Those students will disengage like that if you are talking too much. So maybe set a structure of, I'm going to talk at you, but then I'm going to set you a task, or I'm going to allow you time for independent discussion or debate, or you're going to have an activity to do in class, just to give you a break from my voice. Leading on from that as well, though, is, yeah, don't talk too much, but also enjoy the silence when they're not talking. I think it's one of the hardest things for us as facilitators to do, is to stop, is to let them have that time. It's frightening. I remember when we first started teaching digitally, if the students didn't have cameras, if there wasn't any mic, all interaction is through the chat, and that is a really hard thing to do, to stop, to pause, to let them have those conversations. You're sitting there waiting. Is somebody going to type something? Am I going to get a response? Are you still on the chat? Have you left me? Are you making a cup of tea? It's nerve-wracking, but just trust in it. It will be happening. If they are in a classroom setting, you can use the teacher to check in with them. Is everything okay? Don't be afraid to break away from tradition. So I've talked a lot about using a poem, use storytelling, use rhyme, use rhythm, use music. You can do this along with PowerPoints. So we have sound clips on our PowerPoints to kind of add to what we've just been saying. And then you can build on that. So we'll hear the MPs going here, here, and then we'll all do that in class. You can add in those sound effects if they're having debates. So yeah, there's lots that you can do. Use those props. Think of different ways that you can interact with the students. And then finally, I know I keep banging on about it, but be accessible. So make sure that what works for mainstream students, either create for SEND students, but you may have SEND students within the mainstream classes. So try and be as accessible as possible. It opens up a wide audience. The SEND audience is massively undertapped. This is a huge market that we could reach into, and it's not only satisfying and fulfilling for us as facilitators, but people are crying out. SEND schools are crying out for content. They're crying out for us to engage with them.
I mean, amazing. What a fantastic set of practical skills. I'm busy scribbling them down. I imagine everyone else is too. I know Sean is live tweeting them away because that stuff is absolutely golden. And I think the point around talking and knowing when not to talk is such a key one that we've all gone through. I feel like I've had that moment today. I can feel it as a chair. So I think it's a really good point just to remind us that actually we're all in that same boat. We all have that moment of going, oh, it's a little bit quiet, but it's okay. People need that moment sometimes just to process and think through, particularly when you don't know that audience. It's really important to do that. Phill, you dropped into the chat about think, pair, share. Do you want to just share with everyone, just in case they don't know what that is? And then you can lead into your thoughts on methods you find most effective when sharing with your audience.
Right, okay. So think, pair, pair. Corinna, you spoke really eloquently there about the idea of that silence and using the silence. So if you're coming from my background and thinking about how we do formative assessment, so that's assessment that's ongoing as part of the learning, just to check in and be able to gauge understanding. Think, pair, share is a really good valuable way of doing that, and encourages dialogue amongst pairs. So really what it is, it's an opportunity to present a question, and then what I'll often say to them is I'll preface it with, right, you need to get your thinking caps on for this one. I'm going to ask you a question. You're then going to have time to think it through on your own. Then I want you to turn to your shoulder partner or your buddy, the person sat next to you, and I want you to share your idea. Okay, and then what I often do is, instead of standing at the front, as Corinna has already said, you know, and putting people on the spot, is as they're doing that sharing, I'll go around, I'll listen to the sort of pairs, I'll listen to the small groups, and then I will present that information. I'll say, well, actually, there's some really good ideas that have come out in that think, pair, share discussion. You know, and it's okay to open it up to the floor and say, you know, is anybody feeling as though they'd like to share something? And if nobody comes forward, you can say, well, actually, do you know what? As I walked around, I heard this idea from that group. I heard this idea from that group. Everyone's all got a different idea. That's great. That's fantastic. Let's talk about those different ideas a bit more. You know, very similar with 3-part questioning, which is another way of doing it. So you might go to your first learner and you might ask them a direct question. You've given them that thinking time. They've processed the question. You've come back to them. They've shared their response. Going on to somebody who's around about in the room and saying, well, do you agree or do you not agree? That's another way to build that understanding. And then going to a third individual and saying, well, why do you think they agree? Or why do you think they disagree? So getting them to rationalize their thinking, and especially it's a tool that certainly I started using more and more in primary teaching, and then it works all the way up to the master's levels that we work that we discussed, because it's about saying to them, you know, it's about being critical. It's about understanding that we all have different opinions. We need to respect those opinions, but you're building up that critical thinking through these questions. You know, and also for those children who are perhaps reluctant to engage, they're reluctant to share that, they find it challenging to find their voice in those moments. It gives them the opportunity to share with somebody else, to make sure their voice has been heard, to make sure we've valued that opinion. And then actually turning around and saying, well, actually, it's okay. If you don't have an idea, why don't you tell me what your neighbour said? That's also, it gives them an out, a really lovely out, and it doesn't dismiss them entirely. So I think there's a variety of strategies that we can all take forward. Corinna, you have absolutely gone to town on it, and it was brilliant to hear all those really practical suggestions. So thank you. But yeah, that's a brief overview of think, pair, share, and don't ever lose sight of the importance of formative assessment, of checking in with the learners and saying, well, actually, are you with me? Do you get it? You know, do you have any questions at this moment? Have you had a chance to talk it through with each other? You know, and then bringing it back into the room, because that's how they're going to really embed that learning. That's how they're going to understand the points you're trying to get across, and how they're going to bring that, I suppose, how they're really going to embed that terminology and some of those phrasings that you're using. I hope that's helpful.
Brilliant, thanks, Phill. And I think that's exactly the point, is when we're thinking about this delivery of digital learning, is actually those structures, even if we don't present them, it's sort of a call of how much you present them to students. That's based on your group and how you're doing it, but you hold on to those structures so that you can keep guiding through. Think, pair, share is a great one. Another one I like for starters is any sort of the visible thinking examples. So see, think, wonder is a fantastic one, particularly if you are, for more of us on the Museum Heritage Shrine, showing something that actually you don't expect your students to have the knowledge of. That's sort of the point, is this is a weird, unusual thing, and we're going to talk about this. Actually, what do you see? That's very focused on the practical. Well, I see red, or I see a box, or I see whatever that is. What do I think about it? I think it could be this, I think it could be that. And what does it make you wonder? And that idea of, oh, well, it makes me think, well, I'm wondering who would have made this. I'm wondering who would have used this in the past. Those sorts of 3-stage steps that can just set things off. And it's like having those bits of structured moments throughout your delivery. Nathan, I'm going to come to you next on this question. Obviously, you're dealing with students at a much older level than I think a lot of this conversation is having, but I'm very aware that people on conference will be looking to you for that older age group. So please, to you on what methods you find most effective.
I think Corinna and Phill really gave a lot of good examples of things to consider. So I think I'll limit my discussion into 2 main concerns. The first being skills, technology, and audience. Oftentimes, there's a pressure for our service and our offer to cater to as wide an audience as possible, to get those numbers in, to make it look good for the statistics. But one of the things to consider is not to be afraid to be selective, and not to be afraid to group people into teams that will best complement their preferred way of learning. One example, Phill mentioned QR codes earlier, and it immediately popped to mind. Sometimes we use QR codes for accessibility, but we've actually used QR codes before to exclude. It sounds bad, let me explain. So what we did was, this was a learning session on programming, and we wanted people who already had experience with using computers and using the terminal. So if you do not know how to use a QR code, it would probably be safe to assume that you would have problems with using computers and using the command line. So what we did was, instead of putting up URLs, instead of putting up registration links, everything was in QR code. So if you didn't know how to access the training resources, most likely this training isn't meant for you, and you might consider this other offer instead. So don't be afraid to sometimes do that. And it's also a more polite way of saying no to a certain audience, because they wouldn't know that it's not meant for them. So that's one concern. It's also a matter of being realistic with what we are able to offer, and understanding that, all right, the moment we exceed this number of audiences, this particular type of engagement activity will be very difficult. So you mentioned think, pair, share, see, think, and wonder. One of the things to be very conscious with these activities is each feedback would take a certain amount of time. And sometimes it's the feedback that takes more time than doing the activity itself. And being able to schedule that into your program. Which brings me to the second component, which is engagement. You've already mentioned giving them a voice to be heard, but sometimes that voice comes in different forms. So whenever I design my activities, I'm very conscious not to limit it to, I want you to draw me something. I want you to write something. So nowadays, I tend to phrase my requirements in terms using a particular creative output, discuss this concept. And then I've had a student, for example, that's really bad at speaking, but then submitted an archives case study in prose poetry. And that student actually hit all of the key talking points in prose. So it worked for them, it gave them a voice, and it allowed them to engage with the activity. So be open to multiple channels of engagement and of feedback. There's also the question of, will the digital tools that we are using actually make the conversation better and make it more engaging, or will it just hinder the conversation? When it comes to dealing with smaller groups of people, so usually if it's less than 20 people, I would just rather open the conversation, use something like Zoom or Teams, and then just let them talk. Or just let them use the chat, even if I have to act as the bridge. And sometimes I feel like a major percentage is reading whatever's coming into the chat box, but that's better than, for example, if it's a larger group of 50 people, where I like using things like Slido and Mentimeter and getting that kind of collaboration. It's also being able to So again, for smaller groups, do we want to put them into pairs, put them into breakout rooms, and encourage that kind of conversation? But whenever we do that, it's also important to remember to monitor what they are talking about. So it's also that spending that time to jump from breakout room to breakout room, listening to what people are saying and being available to them. I think Phill has already mentioned this earlier, that make sure that you're approachable, make sure that they can air their concerns, and then they can ask for help whenever you want, especially when it comes time to use new technologies and new tools that they might not have encountered. And I think that would be the final point, that again, will it make the conversation easier? Will it make engagement faster, more entertaining? Or will you just spend more time just trying to figure out how to use this fancy new tool? So I think
I completely agree with you. It's that detail of making sure that it's the right thing at the right time in that right situation, which, you know, we can test and explore with, but it's just about thinking through those processes each time. I think that's a wealth of information about delivery. So I'm going to move on to the second part of our thought, which is evaluation. Evaluation, I think, whatever sector you're in, wherever you're sitting right now in the world, is one of those really, really tricky things. It's often determined externally. So it's a funder, it's a stakeholder, it's someone who wants to know, well, did that work? Was that worth it? And I don't think I've ever met a person, and conference, you're free to challenge me, who has said evaluation is not worth it. So I'm not actually going to ask the detail of the evaluation question, although if conference want to know a little bit more about what methods people are using, let me know in the chat and we'll make some time for it. But actually, my question to panel is, how do you ensure that what you learn from evaluation is actually integrated into the next time you do that, whether that's the next lesson, the next project, the next program? And I'm going to come to Eleanor first on that question.
Thanks. Yeah, really important, really something I'm very passionate about. I would say, you know, one of the things that I always think about is that I think we often talk about lessons learned, but I think someone cleverer than me once said to me, it's only a lesson learned if you actually implement it. Otherwise, it's just a lesson identified. And there's value in that, but you really do need to actually think about what you're going to do with this lesson that you've picked up along the way. So kind of winding back a little bit, I would say recording things and the things you're learning as you go along is really important. You think you won't forget the things that have gone wrong and the things that you could have done better, but you absolutely will as you go through the project. I definitely get amnesia about these things, so don't wait until the end. Maybe it doesn't have to be big and fancy, but just, you know, I have an open document that I basically just add things to whenever I'm like, oh, that could have gone better. I just make a quick note about it and just keep that going, which I then revisit at the end. And I do that with other stakeholders as well, like people I'm working with. I kind of ask them, you know, just keep dipping in. Is like, you know, anytime any nuggets come through and you know them when they come along, make a note. And this all feeds into that iterative design that many of us have talked about here, learning as you go. Again, don't wait till the end. If there's something you can implement now, implement it. So, you know, like you could, and this is the beauty of an iterative design process, is that you've already built in these opportunities to kind of learn as you go and make it better. So you aren't necessarily waiting for the next project. And I really, you know, and that will really help make the project you're working on better. Thinking about when you are wrapping up a project, I would say give it some time, a little bit of time. Give time after a project launches to kind of, because it's nothing like, you know, live. Once something is live, you're going to learn a whole new load of things, and doing evaluation of that, snagging of it of any digital and technological issues, and feedback from your audience as well. Give that time to really get that kind of data in as well. So you're audience facing, but you're also internal. I always hold some kind of wash up session with all the main stakeholders, something around making it structured, not just a tell me what went right or wrong, although there's value in that, but really structuring it around the different areas of the project. And you know what those structures are like. It's, you know, the things that make sense for your project, but just, you know, posing some questions, asking people to kind of respond. I usually do this through post-it notes and things like that, just to kind of get a volume of responses, but also mainly democratizing it a little bit, making sure that everybody has an opportunity to share what is important to them in the areas of project that they work on. And it's really important to make that a safe space as well, where people can share, you know, be open and honest about the things that went well and the things that could have been better, because that's real learning. It's not just an opportunity to pat everybody on the back and say, didn't we do well, although that's very important. It's that, yes, we did really well. There's also these other areas that we should think about going forward. And then sharing it. There's no point in doing this kind of evaluation if you then hold on to it and keep it secret. So I think it's kind of like, not that anybody does that intentionally, but, you know, there's so much great evaluation that then gets buried under the mound of everything else, that everything's being all the work that everyone's doing. So it's sharing that, really identifying those key points about what to share. And I would also encourage that you're not just saying what went wrong, but solutions, thinking about the future. So it's not just a place where you're complaining about things that have gone wrong, but it's like, next time I would do X, Y, Z, that you know, productive solution that will really help to kind of, you know, relate to top tips going forward. Yeah, so I think that's about it, really. Yeah. I guess, yeah, that main point I said at the top about lesson identification and lessons learned not being the same thing, I guess, is my headline.
You know what, that is the key one that I've written down of all of that, because I think that's a brilliant way of phrasing it. It really is that reminder of, you know, sometimes we just default refer to something, and that doesn't mean that it's absolutely everything. At the Abbey, we use a SWOT, so a strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat. But each of those has got to have some sort of action to it. And those things are really important. And I think it's also worth just thinking at this moment, we are all educators in whatever capacity that means in this room. Our colleagues aren't always as self-reflective, as willing to learn, as willing to improve as we all are. And so it's about taking them on that journey of, actually, it's okay to say things that are wrong. It's okay to say things could have been better. That isn't a mark on anyone's character or on anyone's approach to things. And I think then the post-it notes, the democratizing of it, Eleanor, is completely how I do it too, to make sure that everyone feels like they have a voice. Nathan, your thoughts on how you get evaluation into sort of future projects and future programs?
Yes, it's interesting because the way the question is phrased talks about future projects, but I think one of my main points is actually that you should, well, not all the time, but you might consider not waiting until the end of the project to look into the evaluation. One of my experiences just a few months ago was we had a project divided over the course of 4 weeks. And then after the first week, we had evaluations for every week. And we've identified that the workshop style that we were using was just not working for the audience. So by looking at the evaluation in time, we were able to change the subsequent 3 weeks. If you wait until the end of the project, then it might turn out in your evaluation that the project is a failure because you weren't able to do that small iteration while in the middle of the project. Another thing to consider is apply what you learned immediately after. So sometimes we collect information and then we schedule a meeting a month later because we just want to get away from that particular project and we've seen too much of it. But make sure to evaluate whatever data you've collected before you start a new project. I always collect 3 main things in any project. I ask the participant, what did you like most? What did you like least? And what is your main takeaway? So the most and the least means this is what's working, this is what we hated. But the main takeaway, they won't necessarily think of how it's positive or negative. But for us, it lets us know what kind of messaging and what style of delivery worked well for them because it's what they remembered from our offer. So those main things, most, least, takeaway.
Amazing, great practical advice there. Reminder to conference that if you've got questions about anything delivery and evaluation, we will have some time for some questions. So please do let me know. Corinna, anything else you want to add on evaluation at this point?
I think Eleanor and Nathan have kind of comprehensively covered it. Really, I mean, for us, actually, evaluation is feedback. It's quite a new thing with this project. This project is quite new, so we're still working on how best to gather the information, particularly within the SEND audiences. We are relying on the teachers. We use Smart Survey to gather their feedback, but what I'd ideally like is to actually be able to gain student feedback. So trying to think of ways of how is this possible? How can I gather this information directly from the students? It's a lovely issue to have, but one of the issues I'm having at the moment is all the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, which is fabulous for the ego. Can't complain about that. Is it overwhelmingly positive because for a SEND audience there's maybe limited options at the moment, and so people are just being positive for the fact it's for them? Are we dealing with confirmation bias? I don't know. So it's a nice problem to have, but how can I gather? How am I phrasing my questions? Am I using the right format? How can I get kind of constructive feedback that can inform me on changes I need to make? Do I need to ditch forms? Do I need to start workshopping it with teachers? Have a chat with them directly afterwards? So these are some of the kind of the questions, and I'd be really interested if anyone's got any ideas that we're considering at the moment, so we can evolve the programs and take them forward.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, the student one is particularly a difficult challenge. We've certainly tried using sort of feeling associations, and I think other organizations in Heritage have tried this as well. So it's sort of like, how do you feel about, we particularly do it at Westminster Abbey when we're thinking about, we're a big institutionalized church that can feel quite intimidating and quite scary, and actually, can we shift perception from the start of a session to the end of the session? And so that may be around comfort or happiness or inspiration or those sorts of words that actually, and even if we can move people out of a negative to a neutral, or you ideally a neutral to a positive, or a negative to a positive if you're having a big sort of transformational experience, then that is a way of capturing progress that's less numerical, but is still quantifiable, which I think is always the challenge of these evaluation points. And in terms of speaking to other people and the people, I mean, I've found that sometimes you have to be really open with people and say, I'm not going to get offended. You can say anything you like. You can slate this program. I've also had other people do it. So I've helped my colleagues have helped me, and I've said, this really isn't my program. I really don't know anything about it. So you can say whatever you want, because genuinely I'm not going to get offended here. It is inviting that permission to say things. And being aware that there is that audience organization barrier that we constantly have to be aware of. And as much as we go out, it's not always the same when people are coming in that respect. Phill, anything on evaluation from your point? I imagine there's a little bit of thinking back to your teacher days as well, whether you were bombarded with all those, when we say we just want 5 minutes, actually 5 minutes to a teacher is a lot. Anything from your thoughts on that of what our organizations could do to make that process easier?
Yeah, I think coming from a teacher standpoint, like you say, time is precious. So how do you make it clear and concise? If you're asking a question, try and make it as straightforward as you can. If you can use a ranking scale rather than looking for a comment, use a ranking scale. Although, always avoid odd numbers would be my suggestion on that one. So if you're looking to rank from 0, 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, people are always going to pick 3 because they don't want to upset someone. If you go 1 to 6, then it's going to give you a swing one way or the other. Would be a top tip when you're thinking about that. Now, obviously, we're at the moment, one of our big missions is about connecting people to nature. So there are indexes out there, Nature Connectedness Index, which I know other organizations have been using. But for us, that's a 16-point questionnaire. So how do we stream that down? And I'm not at the point of answering that question yet, but we are looking at how do we make it more visual? How do we make it more learner appropriate? We understand that especially in Scotland with the UNCRC, Learner voice is particularly important. It's particularly relevant. It's enshrined in law that learners have a say in their education up here. So we need to make sure that we are doing that, and we're supporting them to have their say be heard, as well as relying on that teacher feedback. How we do that, on the other hand, if anyone has suggestions, please type away. I'd be delighted to hear from you. What I would also say with evaluation is, remember, it's cyclical. You know, it doesn't start when the project starts and it doesn't end when the project ends. You know, there's lessons to be learned. If you are doing the same thing after 5 years, you need to start thinking about, actually, how relevant is that? You know, does it need changing? Does it need tweaking? What needs to be just maybe even a mild refresh? You know, maybe some of the terminology and it's a little bit dated, and that's okay. You know, we would have that conversation with teachers. If that worksheet sat in your cupboard for 5 years and it's never been looked at, why are you keeping it? You know, it's really thinking about that. So whilst quantitative data is really, quantitative data is really helpful. It tells us what's being used, what's being accessed, and what's being not. The qualitative is where you're going to get the reasons why. So bear that in mind, and inviting that honesty, giving people permission to be honest with you, I think is really, really important.
Brilliant, thanks, Phill. I'm fascinated by this not having odd numbers thing. I think a few of us might have thought, oh, hadn't thought about that. We use the Net Promoter Score. I don't know if anyone out there, people maybe let know in the chat if they've tried that. So Net Promoter Score, or NPS, and I'm sure one of my lovely committee colleagues will drop in a link to what that means if you haven't seen it. The thing to be aware of, particularly if you're working with global audiences, is by nation, there is data that people score things differently. So as I'm sitting here in the UK, us Brits are horrendous at giving anyone 10 out of 10 because nothing is ever perfect and there is always room to improve. Our friends across the pond in America, very, very big fans of a 10. So we just have to be aware of where that data is coming from, so that we understand the differences between it, and therefore we're really looking at what our promoters are doing, our neutral area, and our detractors. Amazing. We've got about 9 minutes left. Has anyone from conference got a burning question for our 4 panelists? This is your opportunity to ask it now. Taking Corinna's advice there, being very silent, letting people have a moment to process their thoughts.
I can ask a question, but yeah, if no one else wants to ask one, I was just going to ask, do you ever think about the value of sort of free tools versus ones that you pay for? Because that's something we think a lot about at King's, but one of the issues is that once you sort of invest in sort of proprietary technologies, it can be a bit riskier in terms of sort of maintaining the costs and kind of thing. But then on the other hand, with some of these technologies, they may be free for a time being, but then obviously their models could change. So you can have the same situation. Because one of the things we're trying to avoid here is sort of dependency and sort of becoming strategically vulnerable in that way. And I think it's something we don't think about with technologies. About how much you can become invested in it. And you think about Twitter and Facebook and how critical they are now to some businesses. And if a funding model was ever to be introduced there, it would, you know, for some organizations that could be deadly. So it's just something I wondered if you thought about, like, in terms of the sort of financial thing, about the pros and cons of having something that's paid for versus free.
Who wants to jump in on that? So aware that we've got lots of different organizations here working in lots of different funding models, because funding is an incredibly complicated thing and it depends where you are in the world. Nathan, go for it.
I was gesturing to Phill, but I'm also happy to take this. Well, we are a government institution, which means we are a big fan of open source solutions. One of the things that I think is very important to consider is that usually commercial software ties you into the product. And if you're using something 5 years from now, are you sure it still really fits your offer? And using open source software and open source solutions, as well as free services, removes that kind of tie-in to a particular provider or a particular service and allows you to experiment a whole lot more. There are, of course, always expenses associated with digital offerings, but by linking the expense to the person or to the skill, or for example, your own hosting or your own server, makes it a lot easier to be flexible compared to buying into a particular service. Maybe Phill?
Phill, do you want to add anything to that as you were being gestured to across seas?
I think I come at this from a head teacher point of view, where the the cost of photocopying was usually more than your annual budget allowed. So and now obviously working in a third sector organisation, what I would do is I would ask you, think that there's an opportunity there to carry out your own risk analysis with it. So you need to think, if you're going to pay for something, what is the value added? What are you getting that makes it so much better or more unique than a free piece of software that is readily available out there? Is it because it depends also how that free software is advertised, so or how it's supported. Are there going to be pop-up ads every now and then, in which case it's going to piss people off? So how it's presented, and think about your audience. So if you're working with schools, is it worth speaking to them about the tools that they use? Because if you're going to then go, or you're working with universities, speaking to them about the software that they use, there's no point trying to buy in a technology or asking them to learn a new technology that they're not going to be overly familiar with. What we've already spoken about, that how precious time is for everybody, especially if we're engaging in on-site learning offers. So if you can use an existing tool that they know how to use and that they are familiar with already, then that obviously from my point of view would be a recommendation, and certainly an avenue to explore.